host, Jason Sunkel, tonight. And I guess we got to start with holy cow, the Minnesota Timberwolves.
Um, yeah, I think I said after the first two games that they were going to win it, but then after what had happened, I didn't think there was any way they were going to win it. They lost three in a row. Um, and I think when we recorded last, it was 3-2, accurate? Or we recorded on Thursday. So I think it was 3-2, yeah? So it was 3-2. Or we recorded
It
on
was
Wednesday
after
last
the
Wednesday. Wednesday.
yeah, it was after the Jokic game 5, 40, 17, and 7 or 9 or whatever he had. Probably one of the better offensive playoff games in the history of the NBA. I mean, just especially considering the stakes in that particular game, one of the best performances by any player in any round at any
Yeah,
point that Jokic threw up there. So
yeah. So that
all
happened,
for
and then
naught.
Minnesota won game six, and they asked Anthony Edwards after the game, "Did you really tell the Denver locker rooms that you'd be back for game 7?" He said, "Hell yeah, I did," or something along those lines. And then game 7, they just came out and they laid an egg to start the game, and but you could just tell something. I don't exactly know what happened, but I know that Denver got up 20, and then all of a sudden it was just like a light bulb clicked and Minnesota just dominated. And it probably was partially due to the fact that Anthony Edwards basically put Jamal Murray in a straitjacket and he couldn't do anything. And then Jokic clearly was exhausted. He was dreaming of getting home to his horses, and he couldn't. He couldn't carry the team anymore. The role players for Denver were non-existent. I mean, it's been talked about. Anthony Edwards was terrible from the field, 6 of 24. He had two big shots down the stretch, but he was terrible from the field. But it was the 8 rebounds and the 7 assists, the 2 steals I believe he had. Just his energy, his willingness to make the realization that they're doubling me every time. I've got to trust my teammates. That ended up playing huge. Minnesota gets the win, and man, it's pretty amazing because I don't think anyone could have thought. I know when we were talking back in like February and March when Minnesota was the 1 seed, we were like, this can't be real, right? There's just no way Denver's just no one's going to take them out. But their role players were so bad. And dude, Braun, you need to just stop being baby. Did you see what he said after the game?
No. What did he say?
He said, "I feel like the better team lost. I feel like we were a better team. If you're a better team, you got to win. That's the bottom line. It's the bottom 100% the bottom line. Okay, 2016, the Cavs won the NBA championship, and everyone probably thinks that the Warriors were a better team, right? 73-9 in the regular season. But ultimately, what ends up mattering in the end is who wins a playoff series. You lost, dude. Don't be sour grapes. I mean, I appreciate you like feeling like your team's good, but you clearly weren't good enough. Maybe your coach should have played you more, or maybe you should have shown up more. I don't know, but the fact of the matter is, Minnesota wins. Glad to see Chris Finch is a little more mobile now. Maybe by the time if they get to the finals, maybe he'll be walking. I don't know. We get to, you know, chronicle his injury journey. Um, and yeah, like, what else can I say? Anthony Edwards is amazing. Karl Anthony Towns, Naz Reid, those 2 putback dunks they had were great. I will say, as good of a game as Karl Anthony Towns is, it was slightly curious that they were playing so well with him on the floor with 5 fouls. Maybe it's just indicative of the fact that it's almost like the same thing as the Mobley Allen situation, that maybe they're better when only one of Gobert and Towns are on the floor, even though I know, um, you know, that might that
Nas
might not
Nas
be.
Reed's still a center, but a little bit different than
Yeah, yeah,
each one of those 3 guys brings something slightly different to the table. Obviously, Nas Reed is closer to Karl Anthony Towns in terms of playing style. Neither one of them even remotely compared to sort of what Rudy Gobert does. But anyway, continue.
You there, Mike?
Yeah, I'm still here. Did I lose you?
Okay. I lost you for a second. I don't know what happened there,
Okay,
but all
sorry.
right, sorry. No, it's okay. Yeah, so listen, I just think ultimately what we can say is Minnesota was the better team. They won the game, and now they get to go play Dallas. And I'm excited. Like, listen, we're definitely gonna have a new Western Conference team. We'll get to the Eastern Conference in a minute. I don't feel very confident that we're gonna have a different Eastern Conference team. We'll talk about what I feel confident in. And I know you and I talked a little on the phone earlier tonight, but um, the bottom line is this: Minnesota was better. They won the series. I'm excited to see what happens. I'm excited to see how Anthony Edwards responds in this game. I loved his post game in interview with Charles Barkley when he said, "Bring your blank up to Minnesota," and he's gonna send him some. I'm gonna get your number. Kenny saying 555. That was pretty good. Anyways, man, real quick, I'm gonna say this, Mike. I know this is not really what we want to talk about, but the fact that they're talking about we're never gonna have the inside of the NBA after next season, that'll be a crime. It'll be a crime against humanity. I don't know if you've been following this at all. Have you been
I
following this at
have. It's
all?
such a bet. I mean, it's by far the best studio show. Like as soon as the ESPN games are over, I just turn it off. And
ESPN halftime shows. I don't care about those ESPN halftime shows. I mute
correct,
them. I don't pay any attention to
correct.
them. I don't pay any mind. If they seriously blow that up, that's a shame for the NBA. And I know ultimately what's going to happen. Something will happen, and everyone will be happy with it. It won't be the same though. There's nothing. It will never be the same. Those four guys are just they're the best. They're the best studio show. They're the best studio show for any sport. There's no argument for me. I don't think you can make an argument that there's a better studio show, in any sport. NFL, no, there's not. There's just not. Like I guess the only group that would even be close to that is I do like the Fox NFL guys, but they've changed and circulated a little bit here and now. Now they've got too many people because they've got like six people. It used to be four, and it was good with former Survivor contestant Jimmy Johnson. Um, but there's nothing even close to it. It's just if the NBA truly does this, and because Ernie Johnson's already said he would not leave Turner, okay. Charles Barkley has an out. He's talking about that he was going to be on LinkedIn. Did you see that, Mike? Did you see
No, I
that?
didn't see that.
He said
No.
they said tomorrow we're going to announce I don't know, first team, or they were tough first team all defense at 2 p.m. or something, or May 19th, and he said I'm not going to be here for that. I'm going to be at LinkedIn at 2 o'clock tomorrow or something. It was pretty funny. It's pretty good. Anyways, if they blow that up, it's a shame. And I know that's off topic, but just the way they have the rapport with the players and have the players involved, it's just I just don't know how you go ahead and blow that up completely. Like it's ridiculous. And NBA needs to figure that out. And I have a lot of respect for Adam Silver. I think he's done a lot of good things. But if that simply is what's going to happen, uh, like you got to figure it out, right? You got to figure it out.
I mean, money talks. So if TNT and Turner gets outbid for the NBA, then the studio show is going to go away. Now, I guess it's theoretically possible, although if Ernie Johnson is going to leave, I think he is sort of the conduit that brings all of those guys together in such a way that helps it to make sense. I don't think there's any doubt that Kenny and Charles, if they want jobs, will get jobs at whatever networks end up with the NBA. But you're right that unless you get those four guys together, or at least I think Shaq is maybe the guy that if you lost Shaq, I think that it could probably survive. But certainly Kenny and Charles and Ernie, without any one of those three, I think you're going to get just a different product. And that's not to say that it couldn't be interesting or that you couldn't find somebody else that could do a good job. But just like you said, one of the things that when I'm watching a game and it's on TNT and that game ends at 1 o'clock, I'll usually stay up and at least watch at a minimum the first segment after the game ends. And oftentimes I'll stay up and watch the entire thing, even though it's 1:30 in the morning. And so when you're talking about post-game commentary, to me, that's a pretty ringing endorsement of what those guys do. And I couldn't agree more that it will be a shame if they go away. But yet at the same time, like I said, I think money ultimately is going to decide the fate of inside the NBA and whether or not it's going to continue. So who knows? But all right, let's get back to Minnesota and Denver. No, you're good. I mean, I think it's a valid point, and it's one that I think we'll probably talk about more when it eventually comes out what this next TV deal is going to look like, even though there's a lot of rumors out there that it maybe is already kind of a done deal, but it obviously hasn't been announced, and we won't speculate, and eventually we'll talk about what
they
really
still have
happens,
one more year, right? They still have one more year, right? I think
so.
I think it would be after the next season.
So we'll talk about it at some point. So I think getting back to Denver and Minnesota, first I want to talk about just the general overview of this series. It's honestly, I think, the craziest series I can remember in terms of just all the weird things that went on, and the fact that I know last night's game was close, but the honest truth is that game was very, very similar to the entire series in that Denver dominates for the first half and then 2 minutes of the second half. And then it completely flips and Minnesota dominates. And then when Towns when he does throw the ball away on the inbounds, and it looks like, man, if Denver could score there and cut it to 3 or 5, I can't remember. I think they could have cut it to 5. I think it was 7 when he threw it away. It felt like, okay, is Denver really going to flip the script one more time and steal this game 7 after Minnesota's dominated the second half? But you look at the series in totality. Minnesota goes into Denver, wins the first 2 games. In game 2, they just annihilate the Nuggets with probably one of the best, if not the very best, defensive performance that I can ever remember seeing an NBA team throw at another, obviously really good, in this case, defending champion Denver Nuggets. I mean, just to throw that performance at them was incredible. Then it looks like Denver is dead in the water after game 2. You lose 2 at home. Everybody kind of felt like, man, I know Denver's the champs, but there was a lot of the talk of, hey, maybe Denver's championship road last year. Let's start questioning the validity of their championship. What are we thinking? Are they really the team that is going to be able to repeat? And then, boom, they turn around. They win 2 in Minnesota. They come home for that game 5 that we talked about off the top, where Jokic was just, again, otherworldly. And they take control, or seemingly take control of the series after game 5 and go up 3-2. I think at that point, you and I both, and probably most everybody, expected that Denver was going to finish off the series, probably most likely in 6. And certainly if they didn't win game 6, everybody thought they were going to win game 7. I think people who retrospectively after game 5 said, hey, Minnesota's going to win, I think those people are few and far between. But then you go home for game 6 and Minnesota just, again, throttles Denver. Not a competitive game.
It was just totally it was destruction, Mike. It was just destruction.
Just completely take control of that game. Win game 6. Now we're going back to Denver, game 7. First half, Jamal Murray, 24 points in the first half, just basically getting pretty much anything he wanted. Jokic puts up a 15, I think it was 13, 15, and 5, I think he had in the first half. I mean, just a ridiculous stat line. Now, granted, he missed a bunch of threes in the first half, and that trend continued until the very end of the game when he hit, I think, his last 2. But if he could have made a couple threes, it would have made a big difference in that game, because that's the shot that I think throughout the series that Minnesota sort of decided that they were going to concede to Jokic. Like, if he's going to bang home 6 out of 10 threes, we're probably going to lose, but they kind of had to pick their poison. And so that's one of the things that they gave up. But Murray was incredible in that first half. You get to the second half.
I'll be honest. I'll be honest, Mike. So I was at the PGA this weekend, and my dad and I were keeping it close. Like, we stayed and we watched the game on Friday night, and then on Saturday night, and then on Sunday, like we were driving home, and I didn't like pay much mind to that, but I didn't watch the first half. I just saw the score, and I texted my dad. I was like, well, I guess it's going to be the Nuggets. Like, and he texted me back, yeah, it was pretty much a beating, and he was going to bed. And then like I don't know, it was I checked the score at like 9:45, and I texted him like, Dad, the Wolves are winning. And he goes, how is that possible? They were down. I turned it off when they were down 17 and a half or 15 and a half. And I was like, I don't know, because I didn't pay any attention to it. And then I kind of like skimmed back. Like we didn't think there was any way the way their first half played out. Like it just looked like they were done. It was over.
Well, okay. So you're 100% right. And I think, I don't know if it was on the Simmons pod or the Zach Lowe pod today, but one of the two talked about how the Denver crowd, was there any one person in that Denver crowd who they're up 20, 58, 38, 2 minutes into the second half that thought, hey, Minnesota's going to flip the switch and our defending champion Denver Nuggets with the reigning best player in the world are going to lose a 20-point lead and end up losing a game by 10 points. I would venture to guess there was not one Denver Nugget fan in the arena who could have seen that coming. And to be honest with you, I think neutral fans, I think most people who know basketball, when you're watching that, despite the fact that, again, this game was sort of a microcosm of the entire series where one team is dominant, the other team looks terrible, and boom, all of a sudden, game to game, in this case, half to half, minute to minute, it suddenly just switches. And I was watching it, and even as it was going on, even as Minnesota was coming back and coming back and coming back, it never felt like there was this complete onslaught to get them from 20 back to tied or to take the lead. It just felt like it was just a steady, just, man, we just are kind of imposing our will, but there was no like huge gotcha moment. And then when they finally took the lead, then you had the steal by Conley, and then finally the three from Edwards that put them up 10 with about 4 minutes to go, or maybe 3 minutes to go. And at that point, you were like, this thing is over. You could see it in Denver's body language. You could see it in Minnesota's body language. And that was kind of the moment. But they're really in that run to get back into the game. There really wasn't. A lot of times you're watching a game and you can feel that momentum change. You could just see there's big play after big play, and you just feel it changing. And I felt like that change was super subtle, for lack of a better way of saying it. And you're like, all of a sudden, Minnesota's down by 2. And you're like, how'd that happen? And then boom, they just take over. And there's so many different things and layers to this series and sort of what it means and how players played. And like, I want to start with Denver. And, you talk about Jamal Murray and how good he was in the first half. And he puts up 24 in that first half. And then in the second half, Anthony Edwards switches over onto him. And suddenly things are a lot more difficult than they were in the first half for Jamal Murray. Again, completely and totally understandable that that's the case. But when you look at the totals that Murray and that Edwards put together, I'm sorry, that Murray and Jokic put together, I mean, they combined for 69 points. So it's hard to argue that those two guys didn't come through. I think Jokic ended up being 13 for 28, and Murray, I think, was 13 for 26, if I'm not mistaken. So they shot just under 50% from the field. Jokic ended up with 20 some rebounds, and just was, again, dominant. Maybe didn't make all the plays that
Yeah.
Denver needed him to do. Naz Reid had that big block on him with about, I don't know, 4 minutes to go. That was a huge play. He had a couple chances earlier in the fourth quarter. He made the last 2 threes down the stretch, but by then they were kind of behind and had already kind of fallen off. If he had made 1 or 2 earlier in the fourth quarter, it would have been, maybe a difference maker. But the bottom line is that those two guys were good enough in that game to win a game 7. And if you go into that and you tell Denver fans Murray and Jokic are going to combine for 69 points, I think most people would have walked out of there going, yeah, I think Denver's in pretty good shape. But then you look at the other 3 guys in their starting lineup, and they combined for what? I think Porter had 7, Gordon had 4, and KCP had 5, if I'm not mistaken.
They
So
were
I think
non-existent, Mike. They were non-existent.
they combined.
That's
Yeah,
the
they
bottom line.
they combined for 16 points, and you're just not going to win. And it speaks to the importance of how critical the performance of role players is, because generally speaking, the best players in the league, those guys show up. It's rare that they don't show up in big games. And yeah, there's degrees of how well they show up, but for the most part, you're going to get an A effort from the very best players in the league, which I think, especially when it comes to the playoffs, I think most people would probably put Murray in there, and clearly Jokic, playoff wise, what he does and has done in his career is just absolutely ridiculous. And they just didn't get enough from those role players. And conversely, you look at what Minnesota got. Anthony Edwards, I mean, shoots 6 for 24. And granted, like, he didn't play well. And it looked like they kind of had him maybe giving the ball up a little bit too much. And then when he did shoot it, it felt like they kind of had him off balance. And yet I told you when we talked on the phone today that I still think that he probably hit 2 of the biggest shots of the game. The 3 at the end of the third quarter to bring him within 1 heading into the fourth was, I think, a huge momentum shot and also a huge confidence booster for Minnesota, and maybe a little shot to Denver's confidence, knowing that, hey, we're right here going into the fourth quarter. We've got this. And that's kind of how that moment felt. And then I already cited that 3 that he hit to put him up 10 after the Conley steal against Jamal Murray, where that felt like the dagger. I mean, the 2 teams' body languages after that shot, you could just see Denver completely deflate, and you could just see Minnesota be like, there's no way at this point we're losing this game. And I think the true mark of, look, Anthony Edwards has been spectacular in this playoff. Tonight or last night, he wasn't spectacular in the same way that we think of him putting up 44 points and all the beautiful turnaround jumpers and attacking the rim and all those things. But he did the things that were necessary to help his team win games. And
Yep.
it was just, I mean, it was an incredible performance. Towns, say what you want about him, he's still not my favorite player. I still think he does some dumb things. And that inbounds play that we talked about earlier with about 3 minutes to go could have clearly been one of the all-time
Oh, that was
boneheaded
terrible.
plays. Yeah.
Well, what's boneheaded was that it was clearly off of Denver too. Like, it was clearly off Denver. Like, you noticed that, right?
Well, yeah. There's no. Well, no. I don't know. It was close, man. I don't know if it was clear. But it was. Let's put it this way. It was a very dumb play. At that point, if you can't get the ball in bounds, you gotta call timeout. But okay, so to kind of wrap up on the Denver side of it, I mean, Jokic was as good as you could possibly want from the guy. I mean, he averaged for the series. Here's his series stats. So he averaged 11.5 rebounds, 8 assists, 29 points a game, 1.6 steals, 1 block. He shot 51% from the floor, shot 88% from the line. The only thing you can quibble with is he only shot 22% from 3, which in this game 7, if he'd have shot 40% and maybe made 2 more kind of in the early fourth quarter, late third quarter, maybe it staves off Minnesota. But that's about the only thing that you could say about the guy in any kind of negative fashion. I mean, he was just absolutely incredible. Murray, when they won and in game 7, was really good. In the games they lost, he was terrible. And then the 3 role players did next to nothing. I mean, Gordon had the one big game, which raised his average up. He ended up averaging 14 for the series. Michael Porter averaged 10. Caldwell Pope averaged 8. I mean, you're not going to get it done with those kind of statistics. So disappointing for Denver. Clearly, I think, though, you're losing to a team that, I mean, I think they're probably, look, I still think Boston might be the betting favorite, but I think Minnesota is the best team. I don't know if they'll win it, but I think in my mind at this point, Minnesota's the favorite. So I don't think there's any shame from Denver in losing to the Timberwolves. But man, if you're Denver, you got to feel like you let a second title slip away because now you got to start looking at what do we do? Aaron Gordon's a keeper. Caldwell
Yep.
Pope. Meh. I mean, could you upgrade that spot? Michael Porter Jr., you're paying him on a max contract, and he gave you single digits, I think, in the last 4 games. Like, this is not good enough for a guy whose only real skill is scoring the basketball. I mean, he doesn't pass. I guess he's a better rebounder now than he used to be, and he's a little bit better defender, and he's so long. So he does add that dimension, but you need more. They needed more from Michael Porter Jr. tonight in this series, and they just didn't get it. And for a max contract guy, it feels like, man, I like if you're Michael Porter Jr., so it's interesting, right? When you think about him, I think about could Michael Porter Jr. be a good stats, bad team guy? Like he seems like the perfect good
Candidate.
stats, bad team dude.
Hey, are you ready for it? Theoretical.
Yeah,
Theoretical Michael Porter
Yeah.
Jr.
Okay.
Right? Like theoretically could be really, really good on a really, really bad team. Like he might be theoretical Rodney Hood 2.0. What do you think, Mike? I know
Michael Porter could average on a bad team. Michael Porter could easily average 20 plus a game, easily. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I don't think if Michael Porter right now, Michael Porter is probably what the 4th best player on the Nuggets.
Jokic, Murray,
Gordon, I think probably because of his all-around ability and the things that he does.
I mean, I
for that
guess
team.
I think. Oh man, I think Gordon and I don't know. Gordon and him are pretty equal. I think.
It's a toss-up. I mean, they do different things. I think most people in a vacuum, if you have a winning team, I think most people would probably say Aaron Gordon does more to help your team win. But clearly, Porter Jr. has a ton of offensive talent. But I guess my point is that you need more out of that guy. And look, he was very good last year on their run to the championship. He was good in the first round series against the Lakers. He clearly has talent. There's things that he can do. He didn't play particularly well in this series. I think if you're Denver, the question you're asking yourself is paying him max money. Now, if you're going to trade him, that means you have to find somebody who wants to also pay Michael Porter Jr. max money, which I don't know who that team might be. But I think if you're Denver, you're asking the question, can we find a better player for that spot? And Christian Braun, honestly, he closed most of the games in this series being out on the floor instead of Michael Porter Jr., which is good for Christian Braun, but I'm not sure it's good for the Denver Nuggets and clearly not good for Michael Porter Jr. So, look, the Nuggets have to be disappointed they lost, but I don't think it's, normally you think of a team losing in the second round and you think, they weren't really close to a title. I think Denver still could convince themselves and bring this entire team back kind of as constituted and feel pretty good about their chances next year to come back and win another championship. Now, again, windows close fast because dudes get hurt or something happens or you try to make a move and it backfires. But despite losing the second round, I think Denver, would you agree, next year Denver goes into the season as one of the championship favorites still?
I mean, still, yeah.
This entire group. Yeah, for sure,
right? Yeah, for sure.
All right.
For sure.
So let's shift to Minnesota. Give me your thoughts on, just throw a guy or two at me on Minnesota because I know I've been talking about Denver for a while.
Well, I mean, I think like you want me to throw a guy or two Minnesota in regards to what? Like
in regards to whatever. Just give me your thoughts on, I don't know, pick a guy.
I mean, Anthony Edwards. Here's what I'm going to say. Anthony Edwards could be the best player on a championship team. I mean, that's probably not big of a stretch, right? But he's also 21 years old. So
22.
I'm not, or 22. I'm not. It's not a hot take though to say that, right? I mean,
no, it's not a hot take at all. I mean, like I said, I think Minnesota's the favorite, right? If Anthony Edwards, let's put it this way.
Boston's the favorite, Mike. Boston's the favorite. Whether we want to admit it or not, and whether we want to admit that they deserve to be the favorite, they're the favorite.
That's fine. In my mind, I think Minnesota. I would favor Minnesota in a Minnesota-Boston series. I would put my money on Minnesota. But anyway, go ahead.
I mean, he's the best player. He's the best player on their team. He could easily be the best player on a championship machine. And more importantly, he's 22. Like, how much can he grow? He is okay, Mike. I'm ready for this. This is Hot Take Express. He's everything we wanted Zion to be.
Yeah, different player, but from a physical standpoint, has every tool that you could want in a basketball player. Fast, strong, jumps out of the building, just incredibly competitive. Seemingly, at this point, what we've seen in these playoffs, mentally tough, a leader, and again, doing it all at 22 years old. If Minnesota wins the championship, I don't see a path for that to happen unless Anthony Edwards is the NBA Finals MVP. And if he's the Finals MVP at 22 years old, I don't know what we're looking at from a career standpoint, because when you start thinking about who they've gone through in order to get to the NBA championship, if he does that. So you figure you go through Jokic, now you're going to go through Luka, and then you're going to go through most likely the 64, 65 win Celtics and Tatum and Brown, who have already been to 6 of the past 8 Eastern Conference finals and have already been to the NBA finals once. And he's going to beat those 3 teams in succession, not to mention knocking out the Clippers. I mean, you're not talking about you're not saying that that's a weak run to the championship the way people were talking about Denver and their run to the title last year. So, yeah, I mean, Edwards, I think the game that he played on Sunday night where he didn't have his offensive game and yet he was still tremendously impactful. And look, I'm not going to make the Michael Jordan comparison. I told you that the dunk against Phoenix got me to jump up out of my seat in a way that I hadn't since 2016. And it's rare that a guy does something from an athletic standpoint that makes me kind of sit up and take notice. But that dunk against Phoenix and Durant was ridiculous. And I think the thing that I love about the guy is that he plays both ends of the floor. And is he perfect as a defensive player? No. But when he wants to lock a guy down like he did with Murray in the second half yesterday, and I know that when they played Memphis, was that 2 playoff seasons ago when he took John, remember he got beat on the back
Yeah,
door
yeah, yeah,
at
yeah.
the end of that series by Morant. But I mean, he kind of took that on at that point. I think he was 20 years old, maybe. And I just feel like as a two-way player, like that's one of the things that I think you have to respect about Jordan is the fact that he was at one point the defensive player of the year. He was first team all NBA, all defense like 9 times in his career. And he was clearly just a guy who played both ends of the floor. He didn't take plays off. He competed every second. It feels like Ant has that. And then I feel like the leadership, you can see it, you can hear it when he talks, you can see it on the floor. And then look, the track record of Anthony Edwards at this point, as far as his mental toughness and his ability to rise to the occasion, it's a pretty short resume just because he hasn't been put in that position very often. But what we've seen in these 2 series to this point is pretty impressive when you think about the veteran team that the Clippers were throwing at him, and then you think about Denver as a championship team. I mean, if he really gets this done at age 22 and wins the Finals MVP and beats the defending champs, then beats Luka, who's arguably the second best player in the world, and then knocks off the team that had the best record in the league in the finals. I mean, that's a pretty good notch to put on your resume.
Yeah, for sure. And there's just no doubt. Like, if they win, he has to be the best player on the floor, right? If they win the finals, he has to be the best player in the series. True or
I mean,
false?
there's no way there's no way they can win if he's not if he doesn't have a great series. I mean, they're just not gonna win. Nobody's gonna be able to approach
Yeah.
statistically or impactfully what Edwards is gonna do. Plus, he's one of those guys that he has a magnetism to him that you just when he's on the floor, you're watching what he does, because not only is what he does gritty and tough, but it's also, for lack of a better way of saying it, it's beautiful to watch. I mean, he just the fadeaways, his jumper is just pristine in terms of his form. He plays so hard on the defensive end of the floor, and obviously the athleticism and the dunks and things are just eye popping and make you want to jump out of your seat. And so I just think that he's everything that the league is looking for in an American born player, right? Where we're in this situation where we have the four best players in the league right now, clearly, I think, are considered to be the four best. Those guys are all from foreign lands, and that's fine. But I'm sure the league would really enjoy Anthony Edwards stepping up and taking the throne of finals MVP. And then I know that we talked about it again last year with the World Cup in the Philippines, and now we got the Olympics coming up in Paris. And if Anthony Edwards comes off of a finals MVP and then goes to Paris and plays with LeBron and Steph and all these other guys who are veterans, I mean, you're talking about a star turn. You're talking about a guy who comes into next season in a totally different place than where he came into this season. You're talking about Anthony Edwards. It can be the year of Anthony Edwards, the ascension of
Yeah.
him into a spot that nobody saw this coming a month and a half ago. I mean, everybody was talking about how good he was all season, but nobody was talking about him ascending into a top 3, 4, 2 player in the world. And if he gets this done, I mean, he's right there.
Yeah. I guess the other person I want to talk to you like Gobert. Okay, obviously he was a pariah of the whole like COVID situation, but like his defense is just so good. And I know that fifth foul he had in that game last night was a joke, right?
Oh, that was terrible. That was a horrendous call. Horrendous.
Like if you're gonna call it, it should have been on the other guy, not even on Gobert. And right? I mean,
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that call, it was like a complete phantom call where you're like, I don't even know what anybody saw or what anybody's looking at. Jokic goes up for that shot, and Gobert is basically just kind of standing there and puts his arm up and doesn't really even touch Jokic and gets called for the foul. Gobert was bad in the first half. Like all the bad things that people say about Rudy Gobert were on display in the first half, especially offensively. Like he was rumbling, bumbling, stumbling, and taking off balance shots and couldn't catch the ball and gain his balance. He looked completely off kilter, which is one of the things that when people criticize Rudy Gobert, they talk about the fact that offensively he's a net negative because even at his size, you switch a little guy onto him and he can't really punish him because he doesn't have great footwork. He doesn't have great hands. He's not a great finisher around the rim in traffic. And all those things were on display in the first half. And then in the second half, one of the keys, especially in the fourth quarter, was Denver got into foul trouble and Minnesota got in the bonus, like with, I don't know, I think they were in the bonus at like 8.5 minutes to go in the fourth quarter. And part of that was because Gobert was fighting for offensive rebounds and got a couple calls while he was trying to get to the offensive boards on guys from Denver trying to box him out. So that was huge because then Minnesota got to the line and Gobert went 7 for 9 from the line. I think most often during the season, I think he probably shoots around 57, 58%. I mean, he's not a good free throw shooter. And the fact that he went 7 for 9, he had a couple of shots that he threw in that as I'm sitting there watching him, you're like, oh my God, like those two shots went in. He had the one like turnaround fadeaway, and then he had the one left-handed, looked like it slipped out of his hand, and it ended up being a 3-point play. And you're like, oh man, maybe it's Denver's night when those shots go in. But I think Gobert is always going to have his flaws, but for this team, the way it's constructed, and you can say what you want about whether the trade, they gave up too much to get him, whether or not he's worth it. But the fact of the matter is that last year Towns got hurt. They never really got to see what this thing looked like. This year, with both guys healthy and a whole season under their belt, they were able to figure it out. They get all the way to the 3rd seed in the Western Conference. And now here they are sitting in the Western Conference Finals having beat the defending champions. I think it justifies the trade. And you can look at it and say, I still don't love Rudy Gobert as a player. And I think I would probably say that. But at the same time, what he brought to the table in this series, Minnesota doesn't win this series without Rudy Gobert. And he's not perfect, but man, he did some really important things for Minnesota, obviously
Yep.
during the whole season, but certainly in this series. And last night in game 7 he did so many things that helped winning.
Yep. All right. Is there anything else you want to talk about this? We're one game in and we're 40 minutes in, Mike. Do we want to talk?
Towns. Let me talk about Towns. Can I talk about Towns for just a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Towns, I mean, you and I, how many texts have we sent back and forth over the last 3 or 4 years with the clown emoji attached to Karl-Anthony Towns' name?
A few times.
He still had a few boneheaded moments in this series, but for the most part, like defensively against Jokic, look, Jokic put up, we already talked about his stats, 29, 11, and 8. So it's not like anybody shut down Jokic. But you can certainly argue that the combination of Towns being the guy matched up with Jokic and then Gobert being in the help slot certainly at least made Jokic work and think and do things that maybe he might not normally do. So the fact that Karl-Anthony Towns, we're talking about him playing good defense, that's shocking in and of itself. So kudos to him for that. And then offensively, you kind of laugh at him declaring himself as the best shooting big man of all time. And I think that's probably a little bit of an exaggeration on his part. But I mean, in this series, he shoots 51% from the floor, just a shade under 40% from 3, just a shade under 80% from the free throw line. I thought that he was at least relatively under control, and he had a positive assist to turnover ratio, so 21 assists in the series and only 13 turnovers. For Karl-Anthony Towns in pressure moments, I thought there were times during the series where Edwards kind of looked to him, or Edwards was on the bench, or Edwards didn't have it going, and Towns had a couple different stretches in games where he scored 6 in a row, or he scored 5 out of 10 points, or he was a key catalyst in moments where Minnesota needed somebody to step in and score, and Towns was able to do that. It felt like he was in control of himself far more than he had been in past playoff runs, certainly. And you even think back to earlier this year, right? On the 60-point game, and he gets benched with 4 minutes to go. I know we sent the clown emoji back and forth after that game. How many dudes get benched in a game that they score 60? It says something about who he was as a player. But maybe this playoff run is a turning point in his career, and he's going to become a different kind of player, a more mature player, a player who realizes that he's not ever going to be the best player on a good team, but maybe he can be the second best player on a championship team, or the third best player on a championship team. And that's probably a pretty good place to be.
Yeah, for sure. Like, right. I agree completely. Yeah. And he just, sometimes he does give off clownish behavior, but
you're going to have to live with,
and someone we're going to talk about, someone we're going to talk about here in a minute also gives off clownish behavior, but ultimately the proof is in the pudding. He showed up tonight, and listen, the jury's still out. We're now going to the Western Conference Finals, and things have to, continue in order to, for us to continue this discourse, so to speak. Okay. He still has room to grow, Mike, right? Still has room to grow.
Yeah, I agree. But if your second best player in a series is going to put up 19 and 9 on 50% shooting and 40% from 3, you're going to be pretty happy with that. If he can duplicate that in the next series, I think Minnesota will be very happy with that. We'll see.
All right. Well, let's talk about their opponents.
Okay.
The Dallas Mavericks, Mike. Listen, Luka has arguably has been said that he's the best player in the NBA. He's never won an MVP, et cetera, at times. And there are times where I feel that way, but then there are times that I feel like he is out of shape. The first 4 games in this series looked like he was playing into shape. True or false, Mike?
I don't know what to make of Luca from this standpoint. Like, is he? How hurt is he? What's real? What's not? Is he in good shape? Is he not in good shape? Here's what I'll say. I think is he in the best physical condition that he could possibly be in? The answer to that is clearly no. The answer to that is clearly no. Yet, you're talking about a guy in the regular season who basically threw up a 34, 9.5, 9.5 in the NBA. So, as much as I want him to be in pristine condition, it's hard to argue with what he throws up there in the regular season. And then in the playoffs, look, I think he's hurt to some degree. He hasn't played nearly as well in this playoff as he had in his previous playoff appearances, and even as good as he was in the regular season. And when you watch him, I think he was rejuvenated to some degree in games 5 and 6. I told you after game 4, he looked like an old man. Like if I suddenly started to try and get back out on the court and play, like he looked like he was laboring.
Mike,
His face is all red. He could
Mike,
barely move. He
I could
couldn't bend
speak. I
over.
could speak. I could speak to that last night playing basketball. I felt like Luca looked uh, after playing last night for the first time, like playing in a legitimate game that wasn't just me like screwing around playing in an open gym. That like I felt like that after playing last night. I felt like I had gone through like boot camp. It was exhausting to me, but at the same time it was thrilling, Mike. I really enjoyed it, but at the same time I was like, man, I don't know if I can do this 8 more times for this this league. I just don't know, Mike. I literally felt like I had
Well,
gone through.
let's take it a step further. Luca is a little bit younger than you, so he's 25 and also a professional athlete. He
Oh,
shouldn't
look at!
look the
Oh,
way
thanks, Mike. I
he
appreciate you giving me some
he should
credit. Okay.
he shouldn't look the way you look after playing a game at age 25. I
And I
really
was,
think
and
it's
by
a
the way, I was
combination.
chasing around a 23-year-old the whole game, just so you know,
There
Mike.
you go.
I was
Look,
so
I feel like, yeah, I mean, kudos to you for getting out on the court and playing. I'm jealous and wish I could still do it. But anyway, I think uh, Luca clearly hasn't been at his best in the playoffs. In this series, he averaged just a shade under 25 a game, which from his regular season average, he's down almost close to 10 points per game. So he clearly was not at his best in this series. And I attribute that partly to his conditioning. I also attribute that to the injuries, whether it's his knee or whatever's going on. He clearly is not 100% healthy. And yet at the same time, because of the way that he plays and the amount of time that the ball spends in his hands when Dallas is on offense, he still is dictating most of what's going on, at least on that end of the floor for the Mavericks. And he's such a good passer. He understands where to get on the floor, both to make passes and to get to his spots where he likes to shoot from, that he just puts so much pressure on the defense because you can't really hurry him up or speed him up. He just kind of meanders his way to where he wants to get to. He has such great footwork. He has such great strength that he can get pretty much any shot he wants to get. And granted, he wasn't shooting and scoring at the same level that he had been in the regular season, but he's still a load to deal with. And as good as Dort played him in this series, Dort's probably still, you probably ideally want Dort to be 4 inches taller and 30 pounds heavier than what he is to really be able to deal with Luca and still maintain the quick feet and things that Dort has that bother Luca to whatever degree you can bother him. And I mean, I think if Dallas is going to need a Luca that's better than the Luca that they just got against Oklahoma City, if they're going to have any chance of competing with Minnesota, I think that to me is clear. And look, you mentioned the conditioning piece of it. Obviously, that's not going to get solved in this series. I think it would be, I mean, wouldn't it be fun to see if he gave his body the LeBron treatment for an offseason and came back in the best possible condition he could be in? I mean, like I said, he averaged like a 34, 10, and 10 in the regular season. And I think you and I and most experts would agree that We don't think he's in the best possible shape he could be in. It's pretty incredible when you think about it.
Yep. And then listen, there were times in Game 7, Kyrie just decided that he was going to try to take over, Mike. And listen, of everyone, let's think about this. Of everybody that's left in the playoffs, Mike, he's the guy who's done it, right?
Right. Yep.
I mean, he hit arguably the biggest shot in Cleveland Cavaliers franchise history.
Well, I wouldn't say arguably. I mean, that's clearly the biggest shot, and it's arguably the biggest shot in NBA history, arguably.
I would say, yeah. I mean,
It's in the conversation, if only because I think what puts it in the conversation. I mean, there are a couple factors.
Here. Let me see if I can see where you're going with this. So,
okay, I have three things.
The Cavs win the championship. That's thing one.
Okay, that's one. Yep.
It causes Kevin Durant to go to the Warriors. That's thing two.
I wasn't thinking that one, but that's a good one. There's probably 6 or 7 now that I'm really thinking about it. But keep going.
Well, those are the two that I could come up with the top of my head. I don't have anything else, Mike. Go ahead.
It seals a 3-1 comeback.
Okay.
If he doesn't make the shot and the Warriors win that series, they are now the 73-9 Warriors are kind of a footnote to history. But if the 73-9 Warriors win that championship, that team now vaults itself into consideration for the greatest team in the history of basketball. And the fact that was taken away on that shot on the road, when you're the second best player on the team, I mean, it's a huge shot. And I'll say the same thing about Kyrie that I said about Luka 2 minutes ago. Kyrie's going to have to be better than he was in this series if they're going to beat Minnesota. Now, Kyrie was good defensively, which for him is an incredible step towards him being an effective player. I mean, there's been long stretches of his career where he's been, to put it generously, not very good on defense, and that's given him the benefit of the doubt. But he was good, if not better than good, on defense in this series. And he's going to have to continue that against Minnesota. They're going to need him to do more, though, than pick his spots and average 15 points a game. If Kyrie Irving averages 15 points a game against Minnesota, there's no way they're winning. I just don't see how Dallas.
Mike, I honestly, I don't think there's any way that Dallas wins this series. I think this is Minnesota's series to lose for sure. I
agree. The path to Dallas winning is Luka returning to regular season or better form, and he just kind of controls and is able to manipulate. I think the question becomes, when you look at Minnesota and you look at their personnel and who they have, the best guy probably to guard Luka is Anthony Edwards. But I don't think we're going to see 44 minutes a night of Anthony Edwards guarding Luka. I just don't. Which means you're probably going to put McDaniels on him, is what I would guess. But McDaniels, despite the fact that he's long and moves really well, those are things that can bother Luka. But I think the strength factor, I think Luka's going to be able to kind of back him down and maneuver him and move him in different ways with his body and be able to get what he wants to get if he's healthy and moving the way he was in the last 2 games. And then beyond that, I don't know where Minnesota doesn't have multiple guys to throw at Luka. I think that's kind of a tough matchup for them. Not that Luka's not a tough matchup for everybody. Clearly he is. So I think the path to Dallas winning this series is Luka has to be regular season Luka or better. Kyrie's got to score a little bit more. And then you've got to get the same performance out of those 4 role guys that all played really well at times during that series. PJ Washington, Derek Jones Jr., Gafford, and Lively.
Speaking of which, Mike, PJ Washington, really quick. PJ Washington was terrible all Game 7, and then he hit 2 huge shots down the stretch, right? Like
That's right,
Like,
exactly. I mean, and he hits, he gets fouled on the last shot
yeah.
and steps to the line and makes his free throws. And there's a guy who was toiling away in Charlotte that nobody paid any attention to. And suddenly you put him in an environment where he's on a winning team and he shows that he can be a contributor. He shows he can do what he's done on a big stage. And those are things that, look, Dallas didn't know for sure that that's who he was. Obviously, they traded for him and it ended up being a good trade, but they didn't know that for certain. And you look at Dallas's roster, you trade for PJ Washington, you trade for Daniel Gafford, you tank last year so that you can keep your pick. And that pick ends up turning into Lively, who's been tremendous in the playoffs in terms of providing activity on defense, in terms of being a rim runner, a guy who can stretch the floor vertically, somebody who's active, somebody who hasn't been afraid of the moment. Again, they're not asking him to go out and create a ton of offense. They're just asking him to play his role, and he's done that really, really well. So Dallas, when you look at it, Kyrie, how many conversations that we have last year about, man, I wouldn't touch Kyrie with a 10-foot pole. I wouldn't want to be in the Kyrie Irving business. There's no way I would want this guy on my team. I know I said that on the podcast multiple times last
Oh,
year, and that's been proven to.
that was a running theme of the podcast multiple
That's what I'm
times
saying.
last year,
So, I
Mike.
mean, clearly, again, dead wrong, dead wrong. I mean, I said it since we started the
Big
podcast that,
mistake.
well, here's the thing. I said back when Kyrie and LeBron were still together that Kyrie was the perfect second fiddle to LeBron because he can play off the ball, he can shoot off the catch, he can kind of chill and do whatever, not doing much. And then all of a sudden, boom, LeBron has to sit down, or in this case, Luke has to sit down. Now suddenly he takes the reins of the offense. He can score, he can play off that best player. He's the perfect guy for the role that he's in with Luka, just like he was the perfect guy in the role that he was in with LeBron. The problem is that we haven't seen that guy since basically 2016. I mean, I thought that he was gone. And kudos to Dallas for taking a chance, and it couldn't have worked out any better. So again, you look at their roster and you look at what they have, and you go back 18 months ago, and which of these guys that are contributing or even on their team? The answer is nobody. I mean, Luka and Tim Hardaway Jr., who's just getting back from injury and is, I would say, a very minor player in what they have. So the Dallas front office, great job of building this team up. Now they still have a lot of things that are going out the door in terms of draft capital that this is kind of the team that they have, but they're now in the Western Conference Finals for the second time in 3 years. And you got to give them credit for improving their team in the course of the season. The bill's going to come due eventually, but I think you can't be anything but happy if you're the Dallas Mavericks front office or a Dallas Mavericks
Yeah.
fan that this has worked out the way it has.
Okay, so now we got to talk about the other team, Mike, really quickly.
Okay.
Oklahoma City, and the war chest of picks that they have, and just the youth that they have. This team's not going away, right? Like, this team's going to be good for the long haul. Now, the question is, how good can they be? I think there's definitely some holes. There's already reports that the Oklahoma City is going to be trying to be aggressive with getting rid of Josh Giddey, and everything that I've read is due to fit with the team. But I'm assuming it's also because of his legal like, not that he has any issues, but that can't be something that they want to associate with if they can get rid of him and improve their team at the same time. I think that will probably that would not be a negative, uh, you know, situation for them. Now, once again, I don't know who their trade partners are, but I did see that the rumors were they were going to be aggressive there. They obviously have a lot of picks still to come, right, Mike? They still have a lot of picks that they've
Yeah, we can't even name it all. I mean, they have a ton of swaps and picks, and they have their
so
own
so
picks. They have other teams' picks and swaps. So yeah, they have a ton of
so
stuff that they
so they
can
have a
send
ton of
out.
stuff. So, like, this team is built to compete. Team is built to compete in the long term, provided that they do the right things. Obviously, I think they've got a pretty good coach. One coach of the year this year, right, Mike? You won Marco Dagnall one coach of the year, right?
Yes, sir.
And the bottom line is this. I think, considering this was Chet's first year, he kind of underwhelmed me in the playoffs, Mike. I don't know if you felt the same way, but and also
Here's the
as
thing.
my dad were watching the game against Dallas, and he's like, I can't even name a guy on Oklahoma City. He's like, and then I said, well, you may have heard of Shea Gilgeous-Alexander. He's like, oh, that guy, I've heard of that guy. He was in the All-Star game, and he may have been like, I had heard about him in an MVP candidate, but my dad's a casual NBA fan, but he didn't know a single player on Oklahoma City. I could name like a bunch of other teams, and he could at least name one player. He couldn't name anyone in Oklahoma City. There were 0 people that he could
So
name.
I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you the questions about. To me, there's 3 questions. Well, there's 4. One of them you already asked, which is what happens to Josh Giddey. I think clearly Josh Giddey gets traded. I mean, I don't know what he gets traded for. I don't know where he goes, but I find it hard to believe that Josh Giddey is going to be on Oklahoma City. And that's not to say Josh Giddey's a bad player. He just doesn't necessarily fit with the other guys they have who are better than him. And so he ends up being the casualty in that situation. So Josh Giddey will not be on the Oklahoma City roster come next fall. So that's number one. Second
Okay.
question, which I think the answer to this question is a resounding yes, but is Shea Gilgeous-Alexander really a top 5 player in the NBA? And I'm just going to read you his stat line, and then you tell me. So he played in this series 41 minutes. He averaged 32 points a game. He was their leading rebounder with 8 rebounds a game, leading in assists at 7. He shot 50% from the floor. He shot 55% from 3. Now, granted, on only 20 attempts. So if he has a weakness, it's that he doesn't shoot a lot of threes. And then he shot 83% from the line. And in every big spot, I felt completely confident that he could get to the spots that he wanted to get shots. I think that he's good enough to be the best player on a championship team. I think that question was answered. I don't know how you feel about it.
Yeah, I think I think he can be right. Like he was so good.
The one thing he maybe lacks, the one thing that might put him and I don't put him in the Jason Tatum tier of, I don't think he can be that guy. I think he probably can. The one thing is he's just not as physically dominant, maybe as some of the guys we think of as being number one. Like he doesn't jump out of the gym. He's not ridiculously quick. He's not overly physical. He just knows how to play and where to be. So maybe that puts him at, instead of tier 1, maybe he's tier 1A. He's definitely not tier 2. I think he's tier 1A, where he's maybe just not as physically dominant as some of these other guys. But to me, I think he answered every question. Look, he's good enough to be the best player on a championship team. To me, that question's been answered. All right. Second question, or third question, Jalen Williams, the wing Jalen Williams. So there was a lot of talk during the season that, hey, he's developing into the potential. Look, they're the number 1 seed, right? So who's the number 2 guy on Oklahoma City? All throughout the season, I think there was a lot of talk that Jalen Williams was working into that position. Now, again, he's 22 years old. He averaged 17 points a game in this series. He only shot 42% from the floor. I think a lot of people thought that he would maybe step up, and his performance was probably worse than it was in the regular season. I don't see him as being a number 2, and that's the same question I have for Chet. So this is my last question: is Chet a number 2 on a championship team
I
at
think
any
that's.
point in his career?
I mean, I think it's too early to tell that answer, Mike. I think it's too early. He can't. You've got to remember he's coming back from a major injury,
Well, he's
right?
21 years old. He's 21
I
years
think it's.
old. So
I know. And the same
it's
token,
probably
we
too
said
early for both of those guys.
we say Anthony Edwards might be the best player on a championship team at 22. Like I just think it's too early to tell on 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 Chet because of the major injury he's coming from, and all that. I just don't.
My thing with Chet is I look at him and I say, can I ever foresee a situation where he's my secondary playmaking type player? Like you look at, and I know Victor Wembanyama is a freak, but Wembanyama what he does with the ball and his ability to pass. And not that Holmgren can't put it on the floor, because he definitely can, but I don't know that he's ever going to be that dynamic with the ball, which I think limits your ability to be the number 2 option on a championship team. Now, he might end up being a really, really good number 3 or a really poor man's number 2. But again, he's 21 years old. So I think we're right to give Holmgren an opportunity to continue to grow and develop. And look, this team was probably further along than they had any right to be. I mean, their starting lineup in game 6 against Dallas is 25 years old, 22, 21, 24, 24. So, and they have all those assets that we talked about. And Sam Presti's a smart GM, and I'm guessing that they're going to continue to do the right thing. There's a lot of hand wringing about the fact that they didn't go out and get a big at the All-Star or at the trade deadline. Right. And look, who could they have gotten? Right. They facilitated Dallas getting PJ Washington. If you put PJ Washington on this team and take him off of Dallas, does that flip the series? I mean, nobody saw PJ Washington doing what he does. I have no problem with Oklahoma City kind of standing pat and looking at their guys and trying to see what they have, because their window is and should be pretty wide open for about as long as you could expect, considering the age of their guys. Now, their team's going to get more expensive at some point, which limits your flexibility. But still, I think the future is bright in Oklahoma City.
Yeah, and with that also the whole paying thing, we also have to remember is they can eventually maybe trade someone because they're going to be able to replace them with another one of their millions of picks that they have, right? Like,
right, true.
They just have,
true.
They, not saying that A equals, A1 equals A2, but they could probably eventually have the ability to just essentially swap people out and fit into their system, right? I mean, I don't know. That's just
you're trying to make a decision of. Their 4 core guys. Dort's probably number 4, and then Shea obviously is a guy you're not going to let go, and then Jalen Williams and Chet are 2 guys that you're still trying to figure out what's their ceiling, what can they be, and you hope that those 2 guys develop into the types of players that I'm sure Oklahoma City thinks they can be and that many experts think they can be. And if that happens, then you're going to have to pay them, and that's going to be your core. If one of those guys maybe turns out for whatever reason not to be the right guy, either they don't develop the way you think, or maybe they develop in such a way that they're not as good of a fit for the roster, then maybe they're good enough that you can trade them away and get something good in return. You package them with some picks, and all of a sudden you're bringing in a veteran to team with Shea. Maybe that makes sense in the next year or 2. I don't know. But they do have a lot of flexibility, as you said, because of the draft assets that they have, and because of how young this team is. Their runway, their window is pretty open, and should be open for, in NBA terms, for a fairly long time.
Yep. All right, Mike. Anything else?
No, let's go on
this.
Let's go to the
okay,
East.
So whoa, make a pick. We're picking Minnesota, right?
Yeah, Minnesota.
How many
games?
I
think Minnesota. I just think Minnesota's defense is so dominant. I'm going to say Minnesota in 6.
Okay. I'm gonna say. Let's see. They're playing. I'm gonna say. Yeah, 6 is probably likely. I'd like 5 too. I like them ending in Minnesota, but I'm gonna say Minnesota in 6 too. So
there you go. Minnesota has not been afraid of the road, so they won 3 out of 4, and they won 3 out of 4 in Denver.
That's true too.
Feel pretty good. Feel pretty good about their chances.
All right.
So, yeah.
Last one. Okay, so we're already at an hour 10 minutes, Mike. I'm gonna keep this pretty brief.
Yeah.
The Pacers, the Knicks basically. I mean, their team basically all they like. What a shocker! Tom Thibodeau team got all injured in the postseason because they're playing him 45 to 50 minutes. I mean, OG injured, Josh Hart injured, Julius Randle injured, Mitchell Robinson injured, Jalen Brunson ended up with a fractured hand, injured. There's 5 of their 6 main guys, Mike. I mean, which this goes to our point, and we're not going to spend too much time dwelling on this. This is what the Cavs avoided. Just remember that. And I stated it, like, who knows if we would have beat Indiana in the first round, okay? Who knows if we would have beat them? But listen, we got to give it to Indiana. They are tournament tough, Mike. They are tournament tough. They made it to the in-season championship and lost. And I don't know that that's paying dividends here, but it at least is some kind of experience for them to play in a high pressure situation. And once again, if that's the Halliburton that we've seen, if he could play like he's played the games they've won, great. But the games they've lost, he's been terrible. It's like he's bipolar on the basketball court, Mike. You have one Halliburton and you have a good Halliburton, and you have it's almost a Karis LeVert situation here. He's better than Karis LeVert, but it's like he spins a wheel. And which NBA player is he going to play like today? Like that's what sometimes how I feel about Tyrese Halliburton. He was a good version of him of it. Now once again, Miles Turner was exceptional. And to think, there was on the broadcast, Mike. I got, or I don't know if it was the broadcast or like post game or something. I saw, if it wasn't for the Phoenix Suns, the Indiana Pacers would not be where they're at, because the Pacers tried to pay DeAndre Ayton a bunch of money. The Phoenix Suns matched the offer sheet, so therefore it forced the Pacers to stick with Miles Turner, because if Ayton would have come, more than likely Miles Turner was going to get traded, right, Mike?
Like, you would have to guess, yeah. You would
have
to guess.
So the Phoenix Suns have led to the Pacers being in the Eastern Conference Finals when they can't even get their team out of the first round. But they can hire Mike Budenholzer, Mike. I had to work that in a little bit. But
nice, good work.
Listen, I find that a fascinating thought. And listen, who knows what kind of series the Pacers are going to be able to give. I told my dad I was rooting for New York because I felt like New York Boston would be a better series. Now, obviously, that was before Josh Hart got hurt. That was before I knew OG Anunoby was really, really compromised and was just kind of out there taking up space. This was before Jalen Brunson broke his hand. Like, I think a healthy Josh Hart, I think a healthy OG Anunoby, and a healthy Jalen Brunson, it's probably a better series with the Knicks. But the current state of them, there's no way. So I'm glad Indiana ended up winning. I still don't think. I think Boston wins in 5. I think Boston loses a stupid game. I think they lose a stupid game, but I think Boston wins in 5. I know you're probably hoping that it's not 5 and that it's like 7 and that they get, maybe even Indiana somehow wins the series. Listen, and the NBA's worst nightmare is probably Minnesota, Indiana. But the fact that Indiana and Minnesota won proves that maybe the NBA isn't actually fixed, because there's no way that the NBA wanted these two teams to move on. They would much have preferred
Indiana. I think the NBA is okay with Minnesota because Anthony Edwards is the guy. I mean, Anthony Edwards is a guy who can be the face of the league in so many different ways that I think they're okay with Minnesota knocking off Denver. I don't think that I'm sure they would have rather seen the Knicks and the Celtics, and they certainly don't want to see the Pacers in the NBA Finals. But I think the chances of that are pretty low. I mean, you're right. I'm going to be an Indiana Pacers fan for the next 2 weeks, but I don't think that Indiana has enough to beat Boston. What I will say about Indiana, and clearly the Knicks, as we talked about, were decimated by injuries, but Indiana, because of the style they play offensively, where they just keep pushing the ball and pushing the ball and pushing the ball, that they're a team that you're not going to get an opportunity on defense to rest. They're going to keep putting pressure on you, which for that Knicks team was a really tough matchup because they just didn't have time to catch their breath as they were injured. And again, even as they're playing 46 minutes a night, the Pacers offense is relentless. Now, I don't know how good it is against good defense, but it is going to keep coming at you. And so Indiana, if you look down their depth chart, they played 9 dudes legitimate minutes. I mean, Isaiah Jackson played, I don't know, he got 10 or 12 minutes every night. So you're getting guys who are playing all the way through down through guy 9, which is kind of rare in a playoff rotation. So that depth and that ability to just keep pushing the pace on offense, I think is something that the Knicks had a hard time dealing with. I think when you're looking at Boston, clearly Boston, a much deeper team, a much better team, a team that has lots of versatile defenders that they can throw at all these different guys on Indiana. I just don't think Indiana has enough. I don't think their offense is that much better than Boston's, which I think Boston was probably the number one offense in the league all season. I'm not sure that that's a case where statistics may not tell the entire truth, but I don't think Indiana, even if you concede that, hey, I think Indiana's offense is better, which I'm not sure I would completely concede, but let's just say that it is. Clearly, Boston's defense is light years ahead of where Indiana's defense is and can be. And so I just don't, barring the Celtics shooting themselves in the foot or just completely losing touch with what they should be doing, I don't see the path for how Indiana wins this series. I mean, Halliburton would have to be the Halliburton that we saw in the first half of game 7, where that was the first time he looked like the guy from the first couple months of the season where he's taking threes and it felt like, man, this guy just looks confident, looks like that's going in, because for the first 6 games and for the first round series, he didn't look like that at all for even any stretches of games. And so if you're a Pacers fan, I think you have to take some solace in the fact that maybe maybe he's turning a corner if you're trying to convince yourself that you can win this series. And beyond that, like, I mean, I guess Siakam can get you 30 in a game, but Siakam's not what I would call an explosive scorer. Miles Turner is going to give you whatever. He's going to give you his 15 to 20 most likely. And then none of those other guys are really explosive scorers on their team. So even though collectively as a group, their offense is pretty relentless and they keep pushing the pace, I just don't think their offense is enough to push them past Boston when you talk about the advantages that Boston has defensively. I mean, Boston has 4 dudes who are legitimate, really good defensive players who can all switch onto different guys. And that allows Boston to change up how they're covering and what they do and how they play, depending on what the offense throws at them. And so I expect Boston to make life pretty difficult on Indiana trying to score. And then on the other end of it, Indiana has become, I guess, a mediocre defensive team, which is a big improvement from where they were at the beginning of the season. But I don't think a mediocre defensive team is going to do much to harass Boston. I think the series with Indiana looks pretty similar to the series with the Cavs, where, as you said, maybe Boston fritters one away with a stupid performance like they often have. But I think for the most part, Boston's going to take care of business. And I can see 2, 3, 4 double figure wins in this series. And I'll say Boston in 5 as well. Maybe Indiana gets one at home, but I can't see them extending this series out very far.
Yep. So so you're thinking Boston, but we're going Boston, Minnesota then, right?
Boston, Minnesota, I think is
Oh
the
God,
call.
how
I
great
think
will it be? How great will it be when Minnesota beats Boston and we get to
that'll
see
be
Jalen
tremendous.
Brown and Jason Tatum whine again? Oh
Yeah, it'll
God,
be
oh
tremendous.
goodness, it'll be fantastic.
It'll be tremendous. So I guess the positive of the Celtics continuing to advance is at least I know that I'm always rooting for the other team. So that's a positive.
I mean, I think Mike, I think we can say this right now. Whoever wins in the West, we're going to be rooting for whoever wins in the East, right? I mean, I'm not going to root for Indiana.
No,
I
I
mean,
would root for whether Dallas or Minnesota. I would prefer to see one of those two teams win the title. What's interesting again about the NBA finals here as we go forward, you mentioned that Kyrie is the only guy who's done it, but Kyrie's clearly going to be the second best player on Dallas's team. So no matter which team of the 4 wins the NBA championship, you're looking at pretty much a new guy, a new superstar is going to be the number one guy on a championship team, whether you talk Luka, Edwards, Tatum, or I guess Halliburton, although the odds of Indiana winning the championship, I got to believe, are pretty low. But those other 3 teams, I think you can make a realistic case that Boston, Dallas, or Minnesota can win the title. And those are all guys who are at worst top 10 players. And if they win a title and a finals MVP, suddenly vaults them up in terms of the discussion of where they fall as in the hierarchy of NBA player rankings, right?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I agree. Mike, I have one non-playoff related question that I wanted to ask you, and we
All
can
right,
keep
let's
it.
wrap.
We'll keep it.
Let's end this with this question. Go ahead.
There's been rumors circulating that the Cavs are possibly going to be working with the Pelicans and trading Darius Garland and a few pieces for Brandon Ingram. Would you feel good, bad, or indifferent about the Cavs if they traded Darius Garland for Brandon Ingram?
All right, so I've heard that before. And the first time I heard it, my initial reaction was, man. I mean, Ingram this year was not what you would have hoped or wanted for if you were a Pelicans fan, and certainly if you're a Cavs fan, and that's the guy that you're trading for, the guy who we saw this season. It was a tough look for Brandon Ingram this year. And part of that, though, you have to believe is that he was hurt. I think he was a guy who, just like we talked about, Anthony Edwards had an ascension during the World Cup in the Philippines. Brandon Ingram had a descension, for lack of a better way of saying it. And he was terrible. And I think most people went into that thinking that he was going to be a key component of that team. And by the end of that tournament, he was basically relegated to spot duty. He was barely playing and certainly wasn't playing well. So if I look at keeping Donovan Mitchell, trading Darius Garland, what can I get back for Garland? Is New Orleans attaching things? Are the Cavs having to attach things? I don't know where the balance is between those two guys. I guess if you're trading Garland, you have to get back something that can help you to win in the immediate moment. You're not trading Darius Garland for a package of picks if you have Donovan Mitchell on your team. So you need to get something back. So uh, I think you could do worse than Brandon Ingram. I don't know. I don't love Brandon Ingram's demeanor. I don't love necessarily his toughness. I don't necessarily love the way that he plays, where he's a more, he's more of an offensive player. I guess if you have Ingram playing your four and there's your shooting, although Ingram, again, is probably more of a mid range shooter than he is a 3-point shooter. So you have some spacing issues, again, if you're playing Mobley at the five. I guess what I would say is I don't hate it, but I'd like to see what my other options are before I make that trade.
Okay. Uh, I don't really have a feeling either way. I think he would fit pretty good alongside Mitchell. Um, Once again,
He's
that's
certainly a
provide.
second. He's a secondary creator at whatever he is, 6'10", as opposed to a secondary creator in Darius Garland, who's 6 foot. So I like that piece of it. And
Yeah.
Brandon Ingram can pass. Brandon Ingram can score in the mid range. He hasn't been healthy, which worries me a little bit. But I don't hate it. I don't necessarily love it, but I can see, to your point, I can see the fit. But I worry that I feel like you almost need a guy in that four that can really stretch the floor. But again, maybe Ingram being able to shoot it out to 18, 19 consistently, maybe that's enough to spread the floor a little bit so that Mobley can work inside. And again, hopefully Mobley continues to develop as a shooter. I do think that it would be nice to have a guy with size as your secondary playmaker. Let's put it that way.
Okay. All right. So I just wanted to ask you that question, Mike. So
It's a good
thanks for
question.
answering it.
Absolutely. All right. So that was our conference finals preview. Thank you for checking that out tonight. Again, kind of an unbelievable turn of events in terms of Minnesota knocking off Denver. Certainly nobody had Indiana making it to the conference finals. Maybe a few of us had Dallas making to the Western Conference Finals. I don't think you did, or I don't think I did. But it should be an interesting Final Four. And like I said, what's cool is you're going to have some new team, some new guy is going to crack into the NBA Finals MVP, and it'll be interesting to see how the dialogue goes and what the ramifications are in terms of guys' legacies and where things are at. So we should have an interesting next month in the NBA. Looking forward to both these series. I think the Dallas, Minnesota will be the more compelling of the two, but hopefully Indiana can at least make Boston work in the Eastern Conference Finals. But I'm dubious of that. So anyway, on that note, we will leave it there. It is now 12:33 a.m. Thanks for checking out this episode of the Hoopheads podcast, and we will catch you on the next one. Thanks.
Whoa, baby. It was a long
All
one.
right,
Sorry,
brother.
Mark.
Oh man. Whew. It's all right.